Block 1. The Phantom of the Pacific. The year is 1942. The sun hangs high over the immense, shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a seemingly infinite canvas of blue and white. Below, the world is embroiled in a conflict of unprecedented scale, a struggle that has reached these remote, sun-drenched waters. For the young American pilots flying their Grumman F4F Wildcats from the decks of carriers like the Lexington and the Yorktown, the sky is a place of both profound beauty and deep apprehension. It is a domain ruled by a phantom, an aircraft spoken of in hushed, respectful tones in ready rooms and on the flight lines. They call it the Zero. To them, it is more than a machine. It is a myth brought to life, a whisper on the wind that precedes a devastating storm. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a name that would become synonymous with aerial supremacy in the early stages of the Pacific War, was an enigma. It moved with a grace that defied the laws of physics as they understood them. In a turn, it was a hawk. In a climb, it was an eagle. Its range was legendary, allowing it to appear from horizons where no enemy was thought to exist, striking with precision and then vanishing as quickly as it came. The first encounters were a harsh education for the Allied forces. Pilots accustomed to the more rugged, brute-force designs of their own aircraft were unprepared for the Zero's ethereal agility. It could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver virtually anything they could put in the air. The reports coming back from the front lines were sobering, painting a picture of an almost supernatural opponent. In the skies over China, where the A6M first saw combat in 1940, it had swept the opposition aside with startling efficiency. When the conflict expanded across the Pacific in December of 1941, the Zero became the sharp point of the spear. It escorted bombers, protected fleets, and cleared the skies over landing zones with a chilling effectiveness. For the American naval aviators in their F4F Wildcats, a dogfight with a Zero was a lesson in humility and survival. The Wildcat was a tough, sturdy aircraft, affectionately known as the Grumman Ironworks product. It could absorb a surprising amount of punishment, and its pilots were brave and determined. But in a classic, turning dogfight, it was hopelessly outclassed. The Zero could dance around the Wildcat, its cannons and machine guns methodically finding their mark. The early statistics were grim. In the opening months of the war, the loss ratios were heavily skewed. Some accounts suggested that for every Zero lost in aerial combat, as many as 12 Allied aircraft were downed. This was not merely a technological advantage. It was a chasm. The Zero's performance fostered a sense of invincibility among its pilots and a deep-seated respect, bordering on fear, among its adversaries. The legend of the Zero was built on more than just its performance characteristics. It was also built on the skill of the men who flew it. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had entered the war with a cadre of highly experienced, brilliantly trained pilots. Men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto were masters of their craft. They had honed their skills over years of rigorous training and combat experience in China. They flew the Zero not as a machine, but as an extension of their own will, their movements in the cockpit translating into a deadly ballet in the sky. Their confidence was absolute. Saburo Sakai, who would go on to become one of Japan's leading aces, wrote of his belief in the Zero's supremacy, a belief shared by his comrades. They saw their aircraft as a symbol of their nation's spirit and technological prowess, a perfect instrument for the warrior. They believed, with good reason, that they were invincible. This psychological edge was as potent as any technical specification. American pilots, hearing the stories and seeing the results, had to fight not only the enemy aircraft, but also the growing myth of its invincibility. They learned to adapt. They developed new tactics, like the thatch weave, a defensive maneuver where two Wildcats would fly in formation, covering each other's blind spots, forcing a pursuing Zero to fly into the gun sights of the other. It was a strategy born of necessity, a way to counter an opponent's superior agility with teamwork and defensive firepower. They learned to avoid turning with a Zero at all costs. Instead, using their Wildcat's superior diving speed and ruggedness to their advantage. They would make a high-speed pass, fire a burst, and then dive away, using their momentum to escape the inevitable, tightening turn of the Japanese fighter. These were the tactics of survival, not of dominance. They were a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the American pilots. But they also underscored the fundamental problem. They were fighting a superior machine. The Zero dictated the terms of the engagement. It held the initiative. For the pilots, every patrol was a tense affair, their eyes constantly scanning the vast, empty blue for the tiny specks that could materialize in moments into the graceful, deadly shape of the A6M Zero. The early war in the Pacific was, in the air, the age of the Zero. It was a period of harsh lessons, of heroic but often costly defensive actions, and of a growing realization within the United States Navy that to win the war in the Pacific, they needed to solve the riddle of the Zero. They needed a new champion, an aircraft that could not just survive an encounter with the Phantom of the Pacific, but could meet it on its own terms and emerge victorious. The call went out to the engineers and designers back home, to the factories humming with the effort of a nation at war. The challenge was laid down: build a fighter that could tame the Zero. It was a monumental task, an effort that would require innovation, industrial might, and a deep understanding of the nature of the enemy. The response to that call would ultimately come from the very same company that built the rugged Wildcat, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. They had heard the reports from their pilots, they had studied the performance of the Zero, and they were about to embark on a project that would change the course of the air war. The sun was setting on the era of the Zero's undisputed reign, though its pilots, confident in their elegant machines, could not yet see the twilight. A storm was gathering on the horizon, forged in the fires of American industry and innovation. It was a storm that would be given a name of its own, a name that would soon strike a different kind of feeling into the hearts of its opponents: the Hellcat. Block 2. The philosophy of a blade. To understand the dominance of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, one must first understand the philosophy that gave it birth. It was not merely a collection of metal, wires, and rivets. It was the physical embodiment of a specific and potent military doctrine. The aircraft was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, conceived by a team led by the brilliant designer Jiro Horikoshi. His mandate was clear and incredibly demanding: create a carrier-based fighter that could outperform any land-based aircraft in the world. It needed exceptional range, superior speed, a formidable rate of climb, and, above all, unparalleled maneuverability. The Imperial Japanese Navy envisioned a war of swift, decisive battles fought over the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. Their fighter had to be able to escort bombers on long-range missions, deep into enemy territory, and then fight for and maintain air superiority once it arrived. In the late 1930s, these requirements seemed almost impossible to meet with the available engine technology. Engines powerful enough to grant high speed and climb rates were heavy, and the fuel required for long range added even more weight. Weight was the enemy of maneuverability. Jiro Horikoshi and his team approached this conundrum with a radical and uncompromising solution. They would pursue lightness above all else. Every single component of the aircraft was scrutinized, every ounce of unnecessary weight meticulously shaved away. The structure was built from a new, top-secret aluminum alloy developed in Japan called Extra Super Duralumin. It was lightweight, yet incredibly strong, allowing for a slender, delicate airframe that could withstand the stresses of high-G combat maneuvers. But the quest for lightness went much, much further. And it was here that the Zero's greatest strengths, and its most fatal flaws, were forged. To save weight, Horikoshi made a series of critical design choices. The pilot would have no armor plating to protect him from behind. The fuel tanks, located in the wings and fuselage, would not be self-sealing. In American and European designs, fuel tanks were lined with rubber that could swell and seal a puncture from a bullet, preventing a catastrophic fire or fuel leak. The Zero had no such protection. A single well-placed round could turn the aircraft into a plume of smoke and flame. The airframe itself, while strong for its weight, was not designed to absorb significant damage. It was a finely tuned instrument, not a blunt weapon. This design philosophy was a calculated risk, a trade-off that prioritized offensive capability over defensive resilience. The thinking was that a fighter so agile and so skillfully flown would not get hit in the first place. It was designed to strike first, to evade, to outdance its opponent. Protection was seen as a secondary concern, a burden that would compromise the very essence of what made the Zero so formidable. The result of this philosophy was an aircraft that, in 1940, seemed to be a generation ahead of its rivals. It weighed just over 5,500 pounds fully loaded, significantly less than its primary American contemporary, the F4F Wildcat, which tipped the scales at over 7,000 pounds. This lightness, combined with its large wings and low wing loading, gave the Zero its phenomenal turning ability and its impressive rate of climb. Its Sakai engine, a 14-cylinder air-cooled radial, was reliable and efficient, giving the Zero its astonishing range, capable of flying over 1,600 miles with a drop tank. This allowed it to project Japanese air power far beyond the predictions of Allied strategists. When a Zero was on a pilot's tail, it was almost impossible to shake. It could follow any maneuver, stay inside any turn, and keep its guns trained on the target. Its armament was also formidable for its time, typically consisting of two 7.7mm machine guns in the cowling and two powerful 20mm cannons in the wings. The cannons, in particular, were devastating, capable of shattering an enemy aircraft with just a few hits. However, this elegant design concealed a deeper, systemic weakness that would become more apparent as the war progressed. The very features that made the Zero a brilliant duelist in a one-on-one fight also made it vulnerable in a larger, protracted conflict. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks meant that even minor hits could be disabling or fatal. While a Wildcat might limp back to its carrier riddled with holes, a Zero that took similar damage was often lost, along with its pilot. This fragility extended to the human element. The Japanese pilot training program was exceptionally rigorous and lengthy. It produced arguably the finest aviators in the world at the outbreak of the war. These pilots were a precious, almost irreplaceable resource. When they were lost in their vulnerable Zeros, their years of training and invaluable combat experience were lost with them. Japan's industrial and training capacity could not replace these elite pilots at the rate they were being expended. The Zero also lacked certain technological refinements that were becoming standard in Western aircraft. Early models often lacked effective radio equipment, making coordinated team tactics difficult. Pilots often relied on hand signals, a system that was inadequate for the complex, fast-paced air battles that would come to define the Pacific War. So, the Zero was a paradox. It was a work of genius, a perfect expression of a particular strategic vision. It was a blade, exquisitely sharp and perfectly balanced, designed for a single, decisive strike. But the war in the Pacific would not be a single, decisive duel. It would become a grinding war of attrition, a contest of industrial production, technological advancement, and the ability to absorb and replace losses. In this kind of war, a finely crafted blade can become brittle. The philosophy that created the Zero, the focus on offensive purity at the expense of survivability, had given Japan an incredible early advantage. It had allowed them to achieve stunning victories and carve out a vast empire in a matter of months. But as the industrial might of the United States began to stir, and as American designers began to learn from the harsh lessons of early combat, the limitations of that philosophy would be laid bare. The Zero was a champion born of a specific moment in time. But time was moving on, and the nature of the war was changing. A new philosophy of air combat was about to take to the skies, one that prized ruggedness, power, and the survivability of the pilot as much as it prized performance. The era of the delicate blade was about to meet the era of the industrial hammer. Block 3. The men in the silk scarves. An aircraft, no matter how advanced, is only as effective as the pilot at its controls. In the early years of the war in the Pacific, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was flown by a group of men who were, by any measure, among the most skilled and dedicated aviators on the planet. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service were the product of a training regimen that was as demanding as it was lengthy. It was a crucible designed to forge not just pilots, but aerial warriors, imbued with a deep sense of duty, discipline, and an almost spiritual connection to their craft. The journey to the cockpit of a Zero was arduous. A candidate for naval aviation in Japan faced a selection process of staggering difficulty. Only a small fraction of applicants were accepted into the program. Those who were selected embarked on a training course that could last for years, far longer than the training programs of their allied counterparts. The curriculum was relentless, covering every aspect of flight, navigation, gunnery, and combat tactics. The standards were unforgiving. Failure or mediocrity was not an option. This process weeded out all but the most talented and determined individuals. By the time a pilot earned his wings, he was a master of his aircraft, capable of pushing it to the absolute limits of its performance envelope. But the training went beyond mere technical skill. It was steeped in the principles of Bushido, the ancient warrior code of the samurai. Pilots were taught to value courage, honor, and self-sacrifice above all else. They saw themselves as modern-day samurai, serving the emperor and the nation. This cultural and ideological foundation gave them a formidable psychological strength. They flew with a sense of fatalism and a fierce determination that often surprised their opponents. They were expected to be aggressive, to press the attack relentlessly, and to never give up. This mentality, combined with the Zero's superb agility, created a devastating combination. Figures like Saburo Sakai became legends, not just in Japan, but among the Allied pilots who faced them. Sakai, with his incredible eyesight and instinctive grasp of aerial combat, embodied the spirit of the Japanese naval aviator. He described flying as a pure art form, a dance in the sky where he and his Zero moved as one. He and his fellow aces, men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, known as the Devil of Rabaul, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, ran up incredible scores in the early phases of the war. They were national heroes, their exploits celebrated in the press. Their success reinforced the belief, both within the military and among the public, in the superiority of the Japanese spirit and the invincibility of their machines. This elite corps of pilots gave Japan a critical advantage at the start of the conflict. In the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, these veteran pilots and their superior Zeros completely overwhelmed the opposition. They flew with a confidence and precision that was born of countless hours of training and, for many, actual combat experience in China. They were a finite and precious resource, the product of years of investment. This, however, was the system's hidden vulnerability. The very quality of these pilots made them irreplaceable. The training pipeline in Japan was slow and produced relatively few new aviators each year. There was no large pool of civilian pilots or a rapid training program to quickly expand the pilot corps as there was in the United States. Every experienced pilot lost in combat represented a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy could not easily recover. As the war dragged on, the attrition began to take its toll. In the great carrier battles of 1942, such as the Coral Sea and Midway, Japan lost not only carriers, but also a significant number of its most experienced pilots. These were the men who had spearheaded the initial wave of victories, the veterans who knew the Zero inside and out. They could not be easily replaced. The pilots who followed them were the product of shortened, accelerated training programs, rushed to the front lines to fill the gaps. They were brave and dedicated, but they lacked the deep well of experience and the refined skills of the pre-war veterans. They were less able to extract the maximum performance from the Zero, and were more vulnerable to the increasingly effective tactics of the Allies. On the American side, the situation was the inverse. The United States entered the war with a smaller, less experienced group of naval aviators. However, it had a massive industrial and logistical base, and a culture of general aviation that provided a vast pool of potential recruits. The American training program was designed for mass production. While it might not have produced the same level of individual virtuosity as the Japanese system initially, it was capable of generating thousands of competent, well-trained pilots in a relatively short period. As American pilots gained combat experience, the skill gap began to narrow. They were learning the Zero's weaknesses and how to exploit them with their own rugged aircraft. They were learning the value of teamwork and coordinated tactics, facilitated by their superior radio equipment. The story of the air war was therefore not just a story of machines, but of the human systems behind them. Japan had started with a small, perfect cadre of masters, a system that was brilliant for a short, decisive war. The United States, in contrast, was building a vast system for a long, grinding war of attrition. It could afford to lose aircraft and, tragically, pilots, and replace them. Japan could not. By mid-1943, the character of the Japanese Naval Air Arm was changing. The confident veterans of 1941 were dwindling in number. In their place were younger, less experienced pilots, often sent into battle against a growing number of American aviators who were now veterans themselves, flying in ever-improving aircraft and employing well-honed tactics. The silk scarves and the aura of invincibility remained, but the deep reservoir of skill that had made the Zero so feared was being steadily depleted. The human element, once Japan's greatest aerial strength, was slowly becoming its most critical weakness. The stage was being set for a dramatic reversal of fortunes, where a new generation of American pilots in a new generation of aircraft would face a changing enemy in the skies over the Pacific. Block 4. The Grumman Ironworks forges a response. Long before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor, on the other side of the world in Bethpage, New York, a company was building a reputation for creating aircraft that were the complete opposite of the Mitsubishi Zero. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, founded by Leroy Grumman, had a simple, unwritten motto: build it strong, build it simple, build it to work. Their planes were not known for their elegance or their delicate handling. They were known for being tough, reliable, and capable of taking an incredible amount of punishment and still bringing their pilots home. This philosophy earned them the affectionate nickname, the Grumman Ironworks. Their primary naval fighter at the start of the war was the F-4F Wildcat. On paper, the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero in almost every key performance metric. It was slower, had a lower rate of climb, and could not turn with the Japanese fighter. Yet, the Wildcat held the line during the desperate early months of the war, a testament to its inherent strengths and the skill of the men who flew it. What the Wildcat lacked in agility, it made up for in resilience. It featured armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks, design features that the Zero had deliberately omitted. Its airframe was immensely strong. Stories abounded of Wildcats returning to their carriers with wings that looked like Swiss cheese, their controls shot up, yet still flying. This survivability was a crucial factor. A damaged Wildcat that made it back was a pilot saved and an aircraft that could potentially be repaired. A damaged Zero was often a lost pilot and a lost aircraft. The pilots of the Wildcat quickly learned that they could not fight the Zero on its own terms. To engage in a turning dogfight was to invite disaster. So, they innovated. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch developed the famous Thatch Weave, a tactic that turned the Wildcat's individual weaknesses into a collective strength. Two or more Wildcats would fly in formation, weaving back and forth. If a Zero latched onto the tail of one Wildcat, its partner could turn towards it, presenting the Zero with a head-on gunnery pass. This forced the Zero pilot to either break off the attack or face the combined firepower of the American fighters. This and other tactics, like the high side pass or boom and zoom, leveraged the Wildcat's advantages. It was much faster in a dive than the Zero, whose lightweight construction limited its diving speed. American pilots could use their altitude advantage to make a single, high-speed attack and then dive away to safety, regrouping for another pass. They were learning to fight smarter, not harder. These early encounters provided Grumman's engineers with a wealth of invaluable data. They listened intently to the combat reports from pilots like Thatch and Edward Butch O'Hare. They analyzed every detail of the Zero's performance and every weakness that could be exploited. The message from the Pacific was clear. The Wildcat was a courageous stopgap, but a true technological counter to the Zero was urgently needed. Even before the United States officially entered the war, Grumman had been working on a successor to the Wildcat, a project initially designated the F6F. The original plan was for a modest upgrade. However, the shock of the Zero's performance dramatically changed the project's scope and urgency. The design team, led by engineers like Bill Schwendler and Jake Swerbel, went back to the drawing board. Their goal was no longer just to improve on the Wildcat, but to create a machine that could decisively defeat the Zero. They had a crucial piece of intelligence that would shape their design. In July of 1942, an A6M Zero, flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, had crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands. The pilot was lost, but the aircraft was recovered almost intact by American forces. It was carefully disassembled, shipped back to the United States, and subjected to intense analysis and flight testing. For the first time, Allied engineers had a first-hand look at the secrets of the Zero's design. They confirmed its incredible lightness, its powerful cannons, and its agile handling. They also confirmed its critical vulnerabilities: the lack of armor, the unprotected fuel tanks, and the structural limitations in a high-speed dive. This intelligence was a goldmine for the Grumman team. They now knew exactly what they were up against. Their design philosophy was a direct response to the Zero's. Where the Zero was light and agile, the new fighter would be powerful and rugged. Where the Zero prioritized offense at the expense of defense, the F6F would be a balanced design, with heavy emphasis on pilot protection. The Ironworks tradition would continue, but it would be married to a new level of performance. Leroy Grumman himself made a promise to his pilots. The F6F would have the performance to challenge the Zero, but it would be built with the same toughness and survivability that had become the company's hallmark. The new aircraft would be larger than the Wildcat, built around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine was a behemoth, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower, a massive increase over the engines in both the Wildcat and the Zero. This immense power would be the key to the F6F's performance. It would give the new fighter a superb rate of climb and a high top speed, allowing it to dictate the terms of an engagement. It could climb above the Zeros, choose when and where to attack, and use its speed to escape if necessary. The Grumman Ironworks was not just building a new aircraft. It was forging a new strategy for the air war. It was a strategy based on American strengths, industrial power, technological innovation, and a profound commitment to the value of every single pilot. The response to the Phantom of the Pacific was taking shape not as a delicate blade, but as a heavy, powerful, and utterly unforgiving hammer. Block 5. The birth of the Hellcat. The development of the Grumman F6F Hellcat was a masterclass in wartime industrial urgency and engineering pragmatism. While the legend of the Zero was being written in the skies of the Pacific, the team at Grumman's Bethpage facility was working around the clock to create its antithesis. The project moved with breathtaking speed. The first prototype flew on June 26, 1942. This initial version was powered by a Wright R2600 Cyclone engine, but the decision was quickly made to switch to the more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This engine was a true marvel of engineering, a two-row, 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that would become the heart of many of America's most successful combat aircraft. With the R2800 installed, the F6F was transformed. The first flight with the new engine took place just a month later, and the results were spectacular. The aircraft had the power the designers had hoped for. The design philosophy of the Hellcat was a direct and deliberate counter to that of the Zero. The Grumman team, armed with the data from the captured Akutan Zero and the combat reports from the front, knew they could not and should not try to outturn the Japanese fighter. To do so would mean compromising on the very things that made American aircraft so resilient. Instead, they focused on creating an aircraft that could dominate the vertical plane. The Hellcat was designed to climb and dive like no other fighter in the sky. The R2800 engine gave it the raw power to haul its heavy, armored airframe up to altitude at a rate that could match or exceed the lighter Zero. Its top speed, over 380 miles per hour, meant it could chase down opponents or run from a disadvantageous fight. The airframe itself was a classic Grumman design, simple, strong, and built for mass production and easy maintenance. It featured a wide-track, hydraulically actuated landing gear that folded into the wings, making it exceptionally stable for carrier landings, a feature beloved by naval pilots. Unlike the Zero's delicate construction, the Hellcat was built to endure. It incorporated over 200 pounds of cockpit armor, including a bulletproof windscreen to protect the pilot. The critical systems, like the oil cooler, were also armored. And crucially, it featured self-sealing fuel tanks, which could absorb multiple hits without leaking fuel and igniting. These defensive features added significant weight, but it was a trade-off the U.S. Navy and Grumman were more than willing to make. The primary mission of a Grumman fighter was to complete its mission and bring its pilot home safely. The Hellcat's armament was also a significant step up. It was equipped with 6 .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. These guns were reliable, had a high rate of fire, and carried a large ammunition load. While they lacked the explosive punch of the Zero's 20mm cannons, the sheer volume of fire from 6 heavy machine guns was devastating. A well-aimed burst could shred a Zero's unarmored airframe in seconds. The cockpit was designed with the pilot in mind. It was spacious and offered excellent visibility, particularly to the rear, a critical factor in a dogfight. The controls were straightforward, and the aircraft was known for its stable and forgiving flight characteristics. It was an easy aircraft to fly, which meant that new pilots coming out of the massive American training programs could quickly become proficient in it. This was a key element of the American strategy, to create a superior aircraft that could be flown effectively by a large number of pilots, not just a small elite. Production of the Hellcat began in earnest in early 1943. The Grumman factory became a whirlwind of activity. The company's expertise in manufacturing was on full display as they ramped up production at an astonishing rate. By the end of the war, a staggering 12,275 Hellcats would be built, making it the most produced naval fighter of the conflict. This industrial might was an advantage Japan simply could not match. While Japanese factories struggled to produce a few hundred Zeros a month, Grumman was eventually rolling out hundreds of Hellcats every month. The aircraft was not just a technological solution, it was a logistical one. It represented the full force of the American industrial engine being brought to bear on the conflict. The name Hellcat was chosen, a fitting successor to the Wildcat. It was a name that promised aggression, power, and a new, fiercer chapter in the air war. As the first production models began to roll off the assembly lines and onto the decks of U.S. Navy carriers, a sense of anticipation grew among the pilots. They had heard the stories, they had seen the specifications. This was the aircraft they had been waiting for. It was not as nimble as the Zero, and in a slow-speed turning contest, the Japanese fighter still held an edge. But the Hellcat wasn't designed for that kind of fight. It was designed to fight on its own terms, to climb high, dive fast, strike with overwhelming firepower, and survive to fight another day. It was a comprehensive answer to the challenge posed by the Zero. It addressed not only the technological gap, but also the strategic realities of a protracted war of attrition. It was a machine built not just to win battles, but to win a war. The birth of the Hellcat marked the beginning of the end for the Zero's reign. The Phantom of the Pacific was about to meet its hunter. Block 6, the Predator, enters the arena. In the late summer of 1943, the tide of the Pacific War was beginning to turn, slowly but inexorably. The industrial might of the United States was translating into a growing stream of new ships, new equipment, and new aircraft arriving at the front. Among them was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The first squadrons were equipped and trained, and the pilots were eager to test their new mounts against the legendary Zero. The Hellcat's combat debut came in September of that year. Fighter Squadron 5, VF-5, flying from the deck of the USS Yorktown, engaged Japanese aircraft over the Marshall Islands. The first encounters were tentative, a feeling-out process between two profoundly different aerial predators. For the American pilots, climbing into the cockpit of the Hellcat was a revelation. After years of flying the F-4F Wildcat, where survival depended on defensive tactics and teamwork, the Hellcat offered a newfound sense of power and initiative. The roar of the 2,000-horsepower double Wasp engine was a comforting sound. The aircraft surged forward on takeoff and climbed with an authority that left the Wildcat far behind. For the first time, American naval aviators had a fighter that could match the Zero's rate of climb. This was a game-changer. It meant they no longer had to start a fight from a defensive, lower-altitude position. They could climb to the sun, dictate the time and place of the engagement, and hold the crucial advantage of height. Japanese pilots, accustomed to their undisputed vertical superiority, were in for a rude awakening. When they encountered the new American fighter, they initially mistook it for the familiar Wildcat, as it shared a family resemblance. They moved in for what they assumed would be another easy engagement, preparing to use their superior turning ability. The surprise was profound. This new Wildcat was different. It didn't try to turn. Instead, it would often pull its nose up and climb away at a shocking rate, or it would roll over and dive with a speed that the lightweight Zero could not safely match. The American pilots, thoroughly briefed on the new tactics, rigorously avoided the Zero's strengths. The era of the desperate thatch weave was giving way to the confident lethality of the boom and zoom. The doctrine was simple: use the Hellcat's superior engine power to gain an altitude advantage. From this perch, the pilot would scan the skies below. Upon spotting a Zero, he would roll his Hellcat over, dive down at a high speed, line up the target in his sights, and unleash a torrent of fire from his .650 caliber machine guns. Then, without engaging in a turning fight, he would use the speed built up in the dive to climb back up to altitude, ready for another pass. This tactic was brutally effective. It exploited every one of the Hellcat's strengths: speed, climb rate, and firepower, while completely neutralizing the Zero's primary advantage of maneuverability. It also played directly into the Zero's greatest weaknesses. The unarmored Japanese fighter simply could not withstand the concentrated fire from the Hellcat's 6 heavy machine guns. The lack of self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even a short burst could be enough to set it ablaze. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. American pilots felt a surge of confidence. They finally had a machine that could not only survive, but dominate. The fear and respect for the Zero remained, but it was no longer seen as an invincible bogeyman. It was now a beatable opponent, a target. For the Japanese pilots, the experience was disorienting and demoralizing. Their trusted tactics were no longer working. The new American fighter was a brute. It was powerful, incredibly tough, and refused to play by the old rules. They would see a speck high above, and moments later, their wingman's aircraft would falter, trailing smoke, without ever having had a chance to engage. The attrition rate for Japanese naval aviation, already a serious problem, began to accelerate alarmingly. The new Hellcat, combined with the steadily declining experience level of the Japanese pilots, created a lethal combination. The disparity was not just in technology, but in energy. The Hellcat fought with the energy of its powerful engine, using speed and altitude. The Zero fought with the energy of its agility, bleeding speed in tight turns. In the new style of combat dictated by the Hellcat, the high-energy fighter held all the cards. As more Hellcat squadrons arrived in the Pacific, the balance of power in the sky shifted dramatically. The skies over places like Rabaul and Truk, once the exclusive hunting grounds of the Zero, became fiercely contested. American carrier task forces could now project power with a much greater degree of security. Their Hellcat combat air patrols sweeping the skies clear of threats. The Predator had truly entered the arena, and it was methodically beginning its hunt. The early successes were a sign of things to come. The Hellcat was proving to be everything its designers had hoped for and more. It was rugged, powerful, and perfectly suited to the new tactical reality of the Pacific Air War. This was just the beginning. The Hellcat's greatest test, and its most stunning triumph, was still to come, in a massive aerial confrontation that would permanently shatter the myth of the Zero and cripple Japanese naval aviation beyond recovery. The stage was being set for the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Block 7. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A Day of Reckoning. By June of 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had been completely transformed. The relentless island-hopping campaign of the Allied forces was pushing ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The next major objective was the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The capture of these islands was critical. Their airfields would put American long-range bombers within striking distance of Japan itself. For the Japanese High Command, the Marianas represented a line that could not be crossed. They decided to commit their entire remaining carrier fleet to a decisive battle, a final, all-or-nothing gamble to halt the American advance. They gathered a powerful force of 9 aircraft carriers, the core of the Japanese mobile fleet, carrying over 450 aircraft. This was the most powerful naval force Japan had been able to assemble since the early days of the war. They believed they had a secret weapon, new, longer-range aircraft, and the advantage of land-based air support from the Marianas. Their plan, codenamed AGO, was to use this range advantage to strike the American fleet from a distance, beyond the reach of the U.S. Navy's own carrier planes. On the other side, the American Fifth Fleet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, was a naval juggernaut of unprecedented power. It included 15 aircraft carriers, carrying over 900 aircraft. The vast majority of the fighters protecting this immense armada were Grumman F6F Hellcats. The stage was set for the largest carrier battle in history. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the Japanese launched their first wave of attackers. American radar operators on the ships of Task Force 58 watched in amazement as their screens filled with an enormous number of contacts. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were heading directly for the American fleet. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter, an event that would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The American response was a model of coordinated, technologically superior warfare. The fleet's combat information centers, processing radar data, and radio intercepts, vectored wave after wave of Hellcats to intercept the incoming Japanese formations long before they could reach the American ships. The Japanese pilots, many of whom were inexperienced and poorly trained, flew into a perfectly orchestrated buzzsaw. The American pilots were now seasoned veterans, flying a superior aircraft and employing proven tactics. They had the advantages of altitude, speed, and surprise, thanks to their radar guidance. They descended upon the Japanese formations in merciless boom and zoom attacks. The Hellcats, with their immense power and heavy firepower, tore through the fragile Japanese aircraft. The radio channels were filled with the calm, professional voices of American pilots calling out targets. Tally-ho, bandits, 10 o'clock low. I'm on him, splash one. The phrase, splash one, meaning one enemy aircraft downed, was repeated over and over again. From the decks of the American carriers, sailors watched as the sky filled with the distant, telltale puffs of smoke that marked the end of an aircraft. The disparity in skill and technology was stark. The Japanese formations, lacking effective radio communication, were unable to coordinate a proper defense. Their aircraft, including the still agile but now vulnerable Zero, were no match for the Hellcats diving on them from above. The Hellcats could engage, destroy, and then climb away to regain their advantage, repeating the process with devastating efficiency. The Japanese attacks came in 4 major waves throughout the day, and each was met with the same overwhelming and violent reception. By the end of the day, the results were staggering. The Japanese had lost around 350 aircraft in a single day of combat. American losses in the air were fewer than 30. It was one of the most lopsided aerial victories in the history of warfare. The name Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was coined by a pilot from the USS Lexington, who reportedly exclaimed over the radio, "Why heck, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck, perfectly capturing the one-sided nature of the engagement. The battle was a complete and utter catastrophe for Japanese naval aviation. In a single day, they lost the bulk of their experienced carrier pilots and a huge portion of their aircraft. The pilots of carriers like the Shokaku and Zuikaku, proud vessels that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, were decimated. These were losses from which they would never recover. The battle also exposed the fatal flaws in the Japanese plan. Their longer-range aircraft were less capable, and their pilots lacked the navigational skills to effectively carry out the long-distance strikes. Many simply got lost and ran out of fuel. The American fleet, by contrast, had demonstrated a mastery of modern naval warfare, seamlessly integrating radar, fighter direction, and superior aircraft into a defensive system that was virtually impenetrable. The Hellcat was the star of the show. It had proven to be the ultimate defensive weapon, the perfect tool for shattering an enemy air attack. Its performance on that day cemented its legend. The official kill-to-loss ratio for the Hellcat in combat against the Zero would eventually be calculated at a phenomenal 19-1. 19 zeros downed for every one Hellcat lost in aerial combat. The great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a battle. It was the final, brutal verdict on the air war in the Pacific. It demonstrated that the age of the Zero was over. The combination of American industrial production, superior training, advanced technology like radar, and a truly exceptional combat aircraft had created an advantage that could not be overcome. After June 19, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm was effectively broken. They still had carriers, but they no longer had the skilled pilots or the quality aircraft to operate from them. The sky now belonged to the Hellcat. Block 8. The Ascendancy of the Aces. The incredible success of the F6F Hellcat was not just a story of a superior machine. It was also the story of the pilots who flew it. While the aircraft provided the potential for dominance, it was the skill, courage, and ingenuity of the American naval aviators that translated that potential into a staggering reality. The Hellcat era produced a new generation of American aces, men who mastered their powerful mounts and used them to achieve remarkable feats in the sky. Their names became legendary within the fleet, symbols of the new American supremacy in the air. One of the most famous of these aces was Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's ace of aces. McCampbell was the commander of Air Group 15, known as Fabled 15, aboard the USS Essex. He was a brilliant tactician and a gifted pilot who embodied the new, confident breed of American aviator. His most legendary exploit occurred during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the same larger conflict that included the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On a single mission on June 19th, McCampbell and his wingman engaged a massive formation of Japanese aircraft. In a swirling dogfight that showcased both the Hellcat's capabilities and his own extraordinary skill, McCampbell was credited with downing 7 enemy planes. But his most famous day was yet to come. Later that year, on October 24th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell and a single wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, took off to intercept an approaching Japanese force of some 60 aircraft. Outnumbered 30-1, McCampbell employed brilliant tactics, making high-speed passes and coordinating with his wingman to disrupt the enemy formation and pick off aircraft one by one. In the ensuing 90-minute engagement, McCampbell personally downed 9 Japanese planes, a record for a single mission by an American pilot that still stands. He returned to the Essex with just 2 rounds of ammunition left, his fuel tanks nearly empty. For his incredible heroism and skill, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He would end the war with 34 aerial victories, all of them flying a Hellcat. Another top Hellcat ace was Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu. Of Romanian descent, Vrasiu was a skilled and aggressive pilot who had already become an ace flying the F4F Wildcat. When he transitioned to the Hellcat, his success rate soared. Flying with the famed Butch O'Hare in VF6, Vrasiu became known for his keen eyesight and marksmanship. His greatest day came during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a frantic 8-minute period, Vrasiu intercepted a group of Japanese dive bombers and single-handedly downed 6 of them, an incredible display of flying skill and gunnery. He would finish the war with 19 victories, a testament to his prowess in the cockpit of the Hellcat. Lieutenant Cecil "Teddy" Harris was another remarkable pilot, though less famous than McCampbell or Vrashew. Harris flew Hellcats with VF-18 and became the Navy's second highest-scoring ace, with 24 victories. He was known for his quiet, professional demeanor and his deadly efficiency in combat. He, like many other Hellcat aces, demonstrated the perfect synergy between a skilled pilot and a superior aircraft. These men, and hundreds of other American pilots, were not just lucky. They were the product of a superior training system and were equipped with a machine that allowed them to fully exploit their abilities. The American Navy Fighter Training Unit had developed a curriculum that specifically taught pilots how to defeat Japanese aircraft. Cadets studied the strengths and weaknesses of the Zero and practiced the energy-fighting tactics of boom and zoom until they were second nature. This systematic approach to training ensured that even a newly minted pilot arriving in the Pacific knew how to survive and win against a Zero. This stood in stark contrast to the situation on the Japanese side. By 1944, the elite, experienced pilots of the early war were largely gone. They had been replaced by young men with minimal training, sometimes with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. These pilots were sent up in their aging Zeros against American veterans like McCampbell and Vrashew, who had thousands of hours in the air. The outcome was tragically predictable. The ascendancy of the American aces was a clear indicator of the shift in the human element of the air war. In 1942, the advantage in pilot skill had belonged to the Japanese. By 1944, that advantage had decisively shifted to the Americans. The Hellcat did more than just provide a technological edge. It provided a platform that maximized the effectiveness of the American pilot training system. Its forgiving flight characteristics made it easy for new pilots to master, and its rugged construction ensured that many of them survived their first few combat encounters to gain the experience necessary to become veterans themselves. The story of the Hellcat aces is a story of how a well-designed tool in the hands of well-trained individuals can produce extraordinary results. It was the human embodiment of the 19-to-1 victory ratio, a ratio earned through a combination of industrial might, tactical innovation, and the skill and courage of the men in the cockpits. Block 9, The Unseen Advantages of Victory of Systems. The dramatic 19-to-1 victory ratio of the F6F Hellcat over the A6M Zero is often attributed solely to the superiority of the American aircraft. While the Hellcat was undoubtedly a magnificent machine, this simplistic view overlooks the deeper, more systemic reasons for the complete reversal of fortunes in the Pacific Air War. The Hellcat's success was the result of a comprehensive victory of systems, a triumph of American logistics, training, and technology that went far beyond the airframe itself. The first and most crucial element was industrial production. The story of the Hellcat is inseparable from the story of the American war economy. Grumman's ability to produce over 12,000 Hellcats was a feat of manufacturing genius. The design was deliberately kept simple to facilitate mass production. Parts were standardized and assembly lines were optimized for maximum efficiency. At its peak, the Grumman factory in Bethpage was rolling out more than 600 Hellcats per month, an astonishing rate. This meant that the U.S. Navy could not only equip its frontline carriers, but also build a massive reserve. Losses could be replaced almost immediately. If a carrier lost 20 fighters in a battle, a new shipment would be waiting for it at the next supply base. Japan's aviation industry, hampered by limited resources, precision bombing, and a less efficient manufacturing base, could not hope to keep pace. They were producing Zeros by the dozen, while America was producing Hellcats by the hundred. This industrial disparity created a relentless pressure that Japan could not withstand. The second unseen advantage was the American pilot training pipeline. While Japan's pre-war system produced a small number of superlative pilots, the American system was designed to produce a vast number of very good ones. The U.S. Navy established a massive training infrastructure across the country. They drew from a large pool of mechanically inclined young men, many of whom already had some familiarity with engines and machinery. The training program was systematic and constantly evolving. As new tactics were developed in the Pacific, they were incorporated into the curriculum back home. Pilots arrived at the front already knowing the latest techniques for defeating their opponents. Furthermore, the American system had a rotation policy. Experienced veterans were often rotated back to the United States to become instructors, ensuring that their hard-won combat knowledge was passed on to the next generation of pilots. Japan's policy, by contrast, was to keep its best pilots at the front until they were lost, a practice that steadily drained the well of experience. The third critical advantage was the integration of advanced technology, particularly radar and radio communications. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces were floating fortresses of electronic warfare. Ship-based radar could detect incoming enemy aircraft from over 100 miles away. This gave the fleet ample warning to launch its Hellcat patrols. The Combat Information Center, CIC, aboard each carrier, acted as a nerve center, processing the radar data and directing the fighters via radio. A Hellcat pilot was not just a lone warrior. He was the tip of a spear, guided to his target by an unseen network of eyes and ears. He knew the enemy's location, altitude, and numbers long before he ever made visual contact. Japanese forces, lacking effective airborne and shipborne radar for much of the war, were often flying blind. Their reliance on visual reconnaissance and their poor radio equipment meant they were frequently caught by surprise. The Hellcat itself was part of this technological ecosystem. Later models, like the F6F5N, were equipped with their own compact radar sets, turning them into deadly night fighters. These aircraft could hunt and destroy Japanese bombers attempting to use the cover of darkness, effectively shutting down night operations and giving American forces control of the sky 24 hours a day. Finally, there was the doctrine of logistics and maintenance. The Hellcat was designed to be easily maintained in the field. Its simple, rugged construction meant that ground crews on the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier could quickly repair, rearm, and refuel the planes, ensuring a high operational readiness rate. The vast American logistical train meant that spare parts, ammunition, and fuel were always available in abundance. The story of the Hellcat is therefore much larger than a simple comparison of two fighters. It is the story of how a nation organized itself for a total war. The victory was forged not just in the skies over the Marianas, but in the factories of Long Island, the training fields of Florida, and the research laboratories of MIT. It was a victory of the slide rule, the assembly line, and the radio wave as much as it was a victory of the 50 caliber machine gun. The 19-to-1 ratio was not just a measure of the Hellcat's performance. It was a final accounting of the overwhelming power of the American system of war, a system that the brilliantly designed but fragile Zero and its parent nation were ultimately unequipped to fight. Block 10. The Legacy of a Turning Tide. The arrival of the F6F Hellcat marked more than just the introduction of a new aircraft. It signaled a fundamental turning of the tide in the Pacific War and a profound shift in the philosophy of air power. The legacy of the Hellcat is the story of how an industrial democracy, when fully mobilized, could overcome a brilliantly executed but unsustainable military strategy. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the Hellcat's great rival, was a product of a specific doctrine: the belief in a short, decisive war, won by superior skill and offensive spirit. It was a weapon designed for a blitzkrieg, a finely honed rapier intended to achieve a quick victory before the opponent could bring their full strength to bear. In this role, it was magnificent. It was an instrument of aerial art, and in the hands of the master aviators of the early war, it was nearly unstoppable. However, the war did not end quickly. It evolved into a brutal, grinding conflict of attrition, a war of production, logistics, and the relentless replacement of men and machines. In this new reality, the philosophy behind the Zero became a liability. Its lack of protection, designed to enhance performance, led to unsustainable losses of Japan's most precious resource, its experienced pilots. The Hellcat was the embodiment of the opposite philosophy. It was a machine designed for a war of attrition. It was not a rapier. It was a broadsword, a heavy industrial tool. It was built with the understanding that pilots were more valuable than aircraft, that survivability was as important as performance, and that victory would go to the side that could put the most guns in the sky and keep them there. The Grumman Ironworks philosophy of building rugged, dependable aircraft that brought their crews home proved to be the winning formula for a long, protracted conflict. Officially, the F6F Hellcat was credited with 5,163 aerial victories in the Pacific theater, more than any other Allied aircraft. It was the weapon that broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. After the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese carrier fleet was a hollow force. They had ships, but they had lost the pilots and aircraft necessary to make them effective fighting units. This absolute air superiority, secured by the Hellcat, was the key that unlocked the rest of the Pacific campaign. It allowed American naval and ground forces to operate with near impunity. The island-hopping campaign could proceed under a protective aerial umbrella. Naval bombardments, amphibious landings, and logistical operations could all be conducted without significant threat from the air. The Hellcat cleared the way. The legacy of the Hellcat is also a human one. It is a story of how a nation, faced with a formidable challenge, responded with ingenuity, determination, and overwhelming industrial force. It represents the synergy between the engineers who designed it, the factory workers who built it by the thousands, and the pilots who flew it with skill and courage. It validated a design philosophy that placed a premium on the life of the individual serviceman, a deeply humanistic approach to the engineering of war. The Zero, for all its grace and legendary performance, represented a fading era. It was a warrior's weapon from a culture that valued spirit and sacrifice. The Hellcat was a modern industrial weapon from a culture that valued systems, production, and the preservation of its trained personnel. In the end, the systematic industrial approach to warfare proved to be the more powerful and sustainable model. The skies that had once been the domain of the ethereal, dancing Zero were now patrolled by the powerful, purposeful Hellcat. The Phantom had been exorcised, replaced by the Hunter. The turning of the tide was complete, and the course was set for the final chapters of the conflict, a future that would be largely defined by the air supremacy that the Hellcat had so decisively won.